Good afternoon, everybody. My name is Hwang, and I'd like to enlighten you today on a little bit about digital building logbooks and stakeholder mapping to emphasize on the importance of a cross-sectoral approach to data collection and sharing. The limitations in the availability, reliability, and storage of building data have been viewed as recurring impediments in the decarbonization of the built environment, namely when evaluating the real state of buildings, measuring decarbonization progress, advocating the urgency of energy renovations, and during decision-making for renovation and maintenance works. To overcome this, the Digital Building Logbook, or the DBL, was introduced to systematically store any data, information, and/or document that is relevant to a building. For the DBL to operate at its full capacity, all information and data that is stored in it should be easily shared between and beyond the stakeholders of the AECO sectors. However, the same problems of data loss and unavailability can be observed here when sourcing the data to be stored in and/or linked to the DBL. And this is largely because the AECO sectors are traditionally fragmented. There is an immense number of stakeholders involved, and these stakeholders often have conflicting interests. Addressing the gaps in the understanding among stakeholders of the overlaps in the data that they need in common, as well as the significance of their roles in the DBLs and the larger ecosystem, are thus crucial. The study therefore aims to address this gap in stakeholder understanding in the context of building data in DBLs, to emphasize the importance of cross-sectoral collaboration in data collection and sharing. The writing of this paper resulted in a new framework to map DBL stakeholders to ensure that the DBL is used at its full capacity, reliable data is available and can be accessed in DBLs, and stakeholders recognize the urgency for cross-sectoral collaboration in data collection and sharing. To understand the scope of all internal and external stakeholders involved with the DBL, the paper first builds on the findings from several foundational European studies on DBLs, which is then expanded through a two-part qualitative research, the first being the online survey questionnaire, which was conducted to explore the roles of the stakeholders in the various DBL systems. And focus groups were then conducted in collaboration with the Horizon Europe project DemoBlock. With DemoBlock, the sessions were conducted in the 4 regions where the participating DBLs have the most influence in, with the aim to further identify individual stakeholder contributions and significance. The synthesis of the review findings and the empirical analyses resulted in the final mapping of the stakeholders in relation to the phases of the building lifecycle in which they are engaged with the DBL. Early European studies on DBLs identified 17 stakeholder groups that are potential benefiters and/or contributors of DBLs. The study also identified that these stakeholders interact with the DBL at different phases of the building lifecycle. And this is because opportunities for data collection are present at every stage of the building lifecycle, and they each exhibit different needs of data usage. So in the context of DBLs and building data, the various phases of the building lifecycle can be grouped to 3 larger phases. Firstly, the design, planning, and construction phases present the prime moment for data collection on the physical characteristics of the building, including information on the materials used. The primary stakeholders in these phases can be said to be designers, architects, developers, contractors, and material suppliers. In the sales and/or leasing, operation, and property management phases, data collection largely revolves around the operation and performance of the building. Key stakeholders therefore include building owners, tenants, facility managers, utility companies, energy auditors, contractors, and the financial institutions. The repurpose or demolition phases make use of all data collected on the building to support decision-making processes when strategizing the next best step for the building. And it can be renovation, repurposing, demolition, or even the recycling of building materials. Key stakeholders include building owners, demolition companies, product maintenance service companies, and recycling companies. In the subsequent technical study that it was led by Ecoris, the previously identified 17 stakeholder groups were grouped into 5 main user categories, with which the individual user journeys were created to understand how the DBL can be used differently by different stakeholders. A key finding that is significant to this study is that some stakeholders, in this case the construction sector, building owners, and utility companies, were identified as both data users and providers. This multiplicity in the roles of these stakeholders at different phases of the building life cycle provides 2 new hypotheses. The interaction between the DBL and its stakeholders can be two-way. And number 2, the need for stakeholders to proactively engage with the DBL to ensure that the data stored in it is updated, accurate, and remains valuable. Our survey helped to prove both hypotheses. Firstly, while stakeholders can benefit as users of the DBL itself as a tool and the data in it, they can simultaneously play the role of data providers. Though the level of responsibilities across the many data fields may differ, building owners, public authorities, building experts, financial institutions, and both public and private registers are perceived as equally valuable data providers for the efficient collection of data, of building data. To give you a very simple example, building owners, construction contractors, architects, and facility managers are crucial data providers for their role in updating every change that is made to the building into the DBL, but are equally active data users when assessing and planning the necessary renovation or maintenance works to the home, to the building. The survey also proved that the role of the stakeholder as data providers is not one-off. To ensure that the data provided by the DBL is up to date, regular revisions are fundamental, which means that the continuous engagement of the relevant stakeholders to the DBL throughout the entire building life cycle is crucial. It can be deduced here that the stakeholders across the entire construction and built environment value chain should orbit around the DBL for the benefit of greater overall transparency, value chain integration, innovation, and perhaps even circularity in the future. The first conclusion that could be drawn from the focus groups was that the differences in languages, operations, and organizations of the individual construction sectors, as well as the legal framework of the specific geographical regions, influence the defining and mapping of DBL stakeholders to a very, very large extent. These differences naturally increase the complexity when identifying and defining relevant DBL stakeholders in the different practical environments. The preceding studies and the focus groups collectively identified 38 stakeholders that are used in the mapping exercise, which you will see in the next slide. The mapping also adopts the approach to categorize these stakeholders into 2 main groups, data users and/or providers. This approach was essential when identifying the type of data exchange that is necessary at different points of the building life cycle, as well as how the gaps in data sourcing can be resolved with a larger involvement of stakeholders. What you can see on the screen, which is terrible quality, or in the printout, which I have 10, I only have 10 unfortunately, so you have to share, is the overview of the combined findings of the focus group sessions that were later validated by demo block experts. Along the vertical axis, we distinguish the role of a stakeholder as a data user and or provider, whereas the phases in the building lifecycle with which the stakeholders engaged with were identified along the horizontal axis. The phases were first defined through desk research and were later refined with the inputs from the focus groups on the operational aspects of the DBLs in the different regions that we were studying. To show you an example of our analysis, we will zoom into a snippet here. Yeah. In the planning and design brief phases, we could observe that DBL data is most needed by a larger variety of stakeholders in Germany, whereas in the UK, that need is concentrated among those affiliated in the buildings and financial sectors. In the design phase, in contrast, more region-specific stakeholders, such as energy experts and local authorities, project a higher need for DBL data in Belgium than, for instance, in France. Conclusions drawn from the stakeholder mapping exercise during validation largely orbit around a common observation, which is there is too little overlap between the tools and the regions than was hypothesized. A number of causes were identified here. Number one, the inconsistencies in the representation of the stakeholder groups during the focus group sessions. Number two, the inclusion of personal aspirations rather than reflecting on how the DBL is actually used at volume. And number three, the gaps in terminology due to the differences in languages and processes. However, the exercise itself proved that a critical reflection into the AECO sectors, as well as the legal and operational systems in specific regional contexts, are fundamental when defining the stakeholders of a DBL. Being able to identify how the roles are dispersed across unique legal systems and the various steps that are involved have shown to help create discourses around the DBL and the possibilities of data sharing among stakeholders of different domains. And such discourses are crucial to close the gap in understanding among these stakeholders to not only increase the efficiency in the collection of building data, but also the awareness on the significance of their roles in DBLs and perhaps a much larger ecosystem to ensure that the collaboration between sectors are present. This study discusses the challenges of stakeholder understanding in the context of DBLs and calls for a wider discourse around the DBL for the cross-sectoral involvement in data collection and sharing. And this is a crucial and challenging topic because the DBL itself and the European policies around it are still under development. Previous studies indicated that a lifecycle approach to identifying stakeholders is key, but the regional context must also be adequately anticipated to yield improved stakeholder engagement. Our paper therefore proposes a more comprehensive methodology which involves the co-creation between stakeholders of various domains and a mapping matrix to visually represent the DBL ecosystem that is unique to specific contexts. A key takeaway from this exercise is to place emphasis on the fact that the engagement of the stakeholder with the DBL is two-way, and stakeholders should be viewed as both data users and providers. This additional step helps provide an indication of the overlaps in the inflow and outflow of DBL data among stakeholders, therefore demonstrating the relevance of building data to all identified stakeholders. Yes, that was it.